The war in Ukraine continues to rage, but its presence in the international media is steadily fading. Tensions in the Middle East, disputes in the South China Sea, and the Taiwan issue have taken over the front pages. NATO still provides aid, but the internal political momentum is slowing. The plan to increase NATO's defense spending to 5% of GDP has been postponed to 2035, clearly reflecting hesitation. Yet, amid a world battered by instability and a global economy strained by recession, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has issued a startling appeal. Western nations should contribute 0.25% of their annual GDP to support Ukraine's defense industry. At first glance, the number may seem modest, but when scaled to the size of NATO economies, it amounts to an enormous financial demand. This immediately raises a critical question. Is Zelensky truly representing a nation in need, or is he pursuing an unchecked ambition, blind to the hardships facing the rest of the world? Russia. Since the end of 2024, Russia has launched what is considered its most methodical and large-scale offensive since the early stages of the war. Notably, it has employed fiber-optic cable UAVs to counter electronic warfare, giving Russia an edge in complex operational environments. The strategy has shifted from rapid victory to prolonged attrition, gradually wearing down Ukraine's resistance with small, relentless attacks. Capturing towns like Kostiantynivka, Sumy, is not only about territory, but a step toward key logistical routes. Russia is clearly willing to advance slowly but steadily, aiming to exhaust Ukraine both mentally and materially. Ukraine. Under increasing pressure, Ukraine has adopted a strategy of active defense, not just to hold ground but to preserve its forces. Current counterattacks are limited, primarily using UAVs and precision strikes to disrupt logistics and inflict localized damage. Operation Spiderweb is a prime example. Effective for morale and media, but insufficient to change the overall strategic dollars situation. Critical areas such as Kharkiv, Sloviansk-Kramatorsk, and Dnipro are considered core defensive lines. Losing them would pose serious strategic risks. Fortifying these regions shows Ukraine's attempt to hold the core, even if it means sacrificing less critical peripheral zones. However, at the current pace, Ukraine is unlikely to make breakthroughs without large-scale external reinforcement. Casualties on both sides are enormous, though exact numbers remain disputed due to propaganda and information control. Russia maintains its offensives across multiple fronts thanks to its capacity for mass mobilization and willingness to absorb losses for positional gains. Meanwhile, Ukraine is steadily losing elite forces, troops trained by NATO, and its artillery stockpiles are dwindling. Beyond soldiers, civilians have become the primary victims, with repeated airstrikes targeting infrastructure and urban areas that Russia claims host training centers, manufacturing sites, or concealed military equipment. The battlefield has forced Ukraine into a zonal defense strategy, especially in hotspots like Kharkiv, Sumy, and the Sloviansk-Kramatorsk corridor, critical areas for supply routes and eastern defense lines. Losing its advantage in artillery and reserves, Ukraine now focuses on key strongholds rather than spreading forces thin. Simultaneously, it has accelerated the development of UAVs and domestic defense industries to enhance tactical strike capabilities and reduce reliance on Western aid. Yet the shortage of long-range artillery and modern air defense remains a serious vulnerability, making Ukraine susceptible to deep Russian strikes. The current strategy is defend with tech, compensate with willpower, but this cannot last without rebalancing firepower. President Zelensky has called on NATO countries to allocate 0.25% of their GDP annually to support Ukraine's defense. But this proposal raises a harsh and necessary question. In a time of global economic downturn, rising inflation, widespread unemployment, and social unrest, how can a leader like Zelensky blatantly demand massive aid, as if it's a given, without showing any political restraint? Does he consider the millions of Western citizens struggling with bills, job loss, and domestic crises? Or is he solely focused on prolonging a never-ending war to serve his political ambitions? Compassion, if it exists, should start by understanding that every dollar in aid comes from working families grappling with basic needs like housing, healthcare, and education. Yet to Zelensky, it seems the entire world must sacrifice for his goals. If Ukraine is not a NATO member and does not share the burdens of responsibility, demanding 0.25% of GDP annually is not only unrealistic, it risks backfiring in the eyes of the global public. In truth, the growing indifference from Western leaders toward Zelensky is undeniable. At recent G7, NATO summits, and international declarations, Ukraine no longer holds the central stage as it did in 2022. European leaders now avoid promising specific military aid, and the US is distracted by a deeply polarized election. This silence and cooling of political enthusiasm reflect one thing clearly. The West no longer wishes to stand endlessly behind a war with no clear end, especially when its leader is increasingly losing sympathy. The war rages on, but if Ukraine continues to depend on aid without articulating a long-term strategy, its survival will no longer hinge on military power. It will depend on answering one question: what is Ukraine really fighting to become, and is that path convincing to the world? This is no longer a war of bullets. It is a battle for trust and strategic identity in a rapidly changing world. If this article raises the questions the world needs to face, leave a comment and share your perspective. A like supports honest viewpoints. A share helps others escape media conditioning and think independently. We're not against anyone, we just demand the truth. And that begins with you.